Did you ever beg for those breakfasts black mothers made, the ones that lit up 1960s mornings? These breakfasts shaped family routines and school day memories in ways kids never forgot. When did moments that good slip out of our kitchens? Hot buttered grits with sugar or cheese were the quiet heartbeat of many 1960s. Black kitchens, the kind of breakfast that slid into a bowl steaming and soft before the sun was fully up. Mothers stirred the pot slowly, scraping the bottom so nothing stuck, adding butter until it melted into the grains like sunlight sinking into snow. Every child had a favorite version. Some begged for sugar because it made the bowl taste like dessert, warm and sweet and comforting on rushed school mornings. Others loved cheese melted in until the grits turned golden and stretchy, sticking to the spoon in a way that made the dish feel special. Even when money was tight, grits were cheap, filling, and steady, the kind of food that made sure no one walked out the door hungry. They tasted like warmth, like routine, like the kind of love that showed up before sunrise without ever being spoken aloud. As boxed cereals and toaster pastries crept into households, hot buttered grits started to slip out of daily life. But the memory never quite faded. Anyone who grew up eating them can still remember the heavy spoon, the soft steam hitting their face, the way Mama would say, "Eat this first so you do not get hungry in class." One bowl was enough to carry a child through a long bus ride, a long school day, and sometimes a long walk home. It was breakfast built from care, tradition, and the need to stretch ingredients as far as they could go. And even now, one taste can bring back the sound of a kitchen waking up, and the comfort of a mother moving quietly through the morning to make sure her children started the day with something warm in their stomachs. Fluffy biscuits with syrup or jelly were the breakfast treat 1960s kids begged for with wide eyes and hopeful voices, knowing their mother could see straight through them but might give in anyway. These biscuits were not the kind that popped out of a can. They were soft, hand-mixed, cut by a jar or a tin cup, and baked until their tops turned the faintest shade of gold. When they came out of the oven, the whole kitchen smelled like butter and warmth, the kind of smell that made children hover around the stove waiting for permission to grab one. Mothers split them open with their fingers, steam curling into the air, then drizzled syrup or spread jelly inside until the biscuit soaked up every bit of sweetness. Sometimes the syrup ran down the sides, and kids licked it from their hands without hesitation. These biscuits felt like a weekend, even on a weekday, like a celebration even when money was too tight for fancy breakfasts. Mothers made them because they filled stomachs and stretched ingredients, but children loved them because they tasted like happiness before school. As frozen biscuits and fast mornings took over, these tender homemade biscuits started to disappear. But for the generation who grew up on them, one bite still carries the memory of a warm kitchen, a busy mother moving with practiced grace, and the pure joy of getting the first biscuit straight from the pan. Fried cornbread patties made from hot water bread were the quick, crispy breakfast that came together in minutes, perfect for busy mothers who needed to feed many children before the day rushed in. Flour and cornmeal met boiling water until the mixture thickened into a dough that could be shaped right in the palm. The patties hit the skillet with a sizzle, frying in a thin layer of oil or bacon grease until the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft. Kids loved the sound as much as the taste. They begged for them with butter, with jelly, with a drizzle of cane syrup, or just plain hot from the skillet. These patties were the kind of food that taught children to appreciate texture. Crisp outside, tender inside, warm all the way through. Mothers made them without measuring because the recipe lived in their fingers, and every batch tasted slightly different depending on how much water or meal went in. Fried cornbread patties were fast, reliable, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that made sure no child walked out the door hungry. Even when grocery shelves brought new kinds of bread and packaged mixes, nothing matched the flavor of these simple patties eaten at the kitchen table while the morning light crept in. They tasted like survival, love, and tradition all pressed into a single handful. Today, many children have never seen them cooked, but those who remember can still taste that first bite. The warmth, the crunch, the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Smothered breakfast potatoes were the skillet hero of 1960s mornings, a dish that stretched a handful of ingredients into something big enough to feed everyone. Mothers sliced the potatoes thin, letting them hit the hot grease before adding onions, peppers, salt, and a little black pepper for heat. The skillet hissed, the house filled with the scent of frying potatoes, and sleepy children wandered into the kitchen even before they were called. The potatoes softened and browned, edges crisping, onions turning sweet, and the peppers melting into the mix. This was a breakfast you could eat alone or beside eggs, biscuits, or sausage, and it never disappointed. Mothers loved it because it was dependable and cheap. Children loved it because it tasted like comfort, disguised as something simple. A plate of smothered potatoes could fuel a child until lunch, carrying them through long mornings at school or long walks down dusty roads. Over the years, frozen hash browns and faster options took its place, but nothing compares to the taste of potatoes cooked slow in a cast-iron skillet by a mother who knew exactly when to turn them. For those who remember, one spoonful brings back the sound of sizzling grease and the warmth of a kitchen where breakfast meant love made visible. Homemade buttermilk pancakes were the tall, fluffy stacks that made children race to the table before the first one even left the skillet. Mothers whisked the batter by hand, pouring it onto cast iron where bubbles rose through the surface like tiny promises. The pancakes cooked into thick, tender rounds, soft enough to soak up syrup but sturdy enough to hold butter melting across the top. Kids begged for extra because no two pancakes ever tasted exactly the same, and every batch felt like a gift made fresh. These pancakes beat diner versions every time because they tasted like home, like effort, like the quiet rhythm of a mother working before sunrise. Sometimes she added a little cinnamon, sometimes a splash more buttermilk, sometimes she cut them into halves for the younger ones. Each plate carried the same intention: fill their stomachs, start their day right, send them into the world with something warm inside. Pancake mornings were special, even when they were simple, and children looked forward to them more than anything in a box. As mixes and frozen pancakes took over kitchens, the homemade version faded, but anyone who remembers them can still taste the difference. Real batter, real heat, real love poured into every round. Sausage patties made from scratch were the heartiest part of many 1960s black breakfasts, the kind of food that made a child feel ready to take on anything the school day threw at them. Mothers seasoned the meat by hand with salt, pepper, sage, and whatever spices their own mothers had taught them to use. They shaped the patties carefully and laid them in the skillet where they sizzled, browned, and filled the house with a smell that pulled children straight into the kitchen. These patties were crisp on the outside, juicy inside, and full of flavor you could not find in store-bought sausage. Kids sandwiched them in biscuits, crumbled them into grits, or ate them plain with their fingers when they were too hungry to wait for a fork. For mothers, making sausage from scratch was a way to stretch ingredients and control the flavor. For children, it was the taste of a real breakfast. As packaged sausage became easier to buy, homemade patties faded from daily life. But anyone who grew up eating them knows nothing beats the sound of sausage frying in a cast-iron skillet early in the morning. Fried apples with cinnamon turned ordinary mornings into something that felt like a holiday. Mothers sliced apples thin and let them cook down slowly in a skillet with butter or a little bacon grease, adding cinnamon and sugar until the whole mixture turned glossy and tender. The apples softened into something warm and sweet, the kind of side that made every child push their plate closer. Fried apples tasted like dessert disguised as breakfast, and they paired with everything: pancakes, biscuits, grits, or sausage. Kids begged for them because they made the house smell like comfort from the moment the skillet warmed. Even on the tightest weeks, apples were easy to find, and a handful of cinnamon could stretch the flavor far over time. Store-bought pastries replaced skillet fruits, and fried apples slipped away. But anyone who remembers eating them fresh knows they tasted like love cooked slow. Scrambled eggs with onions and peppers were the way mothers stretched breakfast to feed large families without spending much. A few eggs went further when mixed with vegetables, and the colors alone made children feel like they were getting something special. The onions softened, the peppers brightened, and the whole pan filled with steam as the eggs cooked through. These eggs tasted warm, savory, and slightly sweet from the vegetables melting together, Kids loved them spooned over grits or next to biscuits, and mothers loved that the dish fed everyone without waste. It was a breakfast born from necessity but remembered for comfort. On busy mornings, mothers could whip it together in minutes, still managing to fill every plate before anyone ran out the door. Children watched the skillet bubble, listened to the quiet sizzle, and waited for the moment a big spoonful hit their plates. And even though it was simple, it somehow felt complete, like the kind of food that held the morning steady before the day had a chance to pull it apart. Molasses or cane syrup on toast was the simple sweet breakfast that got countless 1960s children out the door with something in their stomachs. Mothers spread the thick, dark syrup across warm toast until it soaked in and dripped at the edges. It was cheap, fast, and full of flavor, a treat that felt bigger than it really was. Kids licked their fingers, wiped their plates, and asked for seconds whenever they could. This breakfast was born from thrift, but it tasted like love and familiarity, not sacrifice. Sometimes mothers warmed the syrup slightly so it softened and flowed into every corner of the bread, turning each bite into something almost candy-like. For children who rarely had store-bought treats, this toast felt like a small miracle on a weekday morning. The smell of the syrup warming on the stove lingered through the house, mixing with the sound of school shoes being tied and doors opening to the cool morning air. It was quick, but never rushed, because everyone stopped for at least a moment to taste that sweetness before the day began. Chocolate gravy over biscuits was the rare, magical breakfast that felt like a holiday, even on an ordinary morning. Mothers cooked cocoa, sugar, butter, and milk into a glossy gravy that poured hot over fresh biscuits. Children begged for it because it tasted like dessert disguised as breakfast, warm and sweet with a hint of chocolate that felt indulgent and unforgettable. It was not an everyday dish, just a sometimes treat, but those mornings became memories children still talk about decades later. The whole house lit up when someone whispered that chocolate gravy was coming, because everyone knew it meant the day was starting with joy instead of hurry. Mothers whisked the pot with careful hands to keep lumps from forming, and the smell drifted down hallways, pulling sleepy children to the kitchen before they were fully awake. The biscuits soaked up the gravy until they were soft enough to eat with a spoon, turning each bite into something warm enough to chase away cold mornings, and long after the plates were empty, the sweetness lingered, on tongues, in the air, and in the memory of a morning that felt like a gift. Fish and grits was the kind of breakfast that made weekends feel special, especially in coastal and southern black homes where whiting was easy to find and even easier to love. Mothers seasoned the fish with salt, pepper, and a little flour, then fried it until the edges turned crisp and golden, filling the whole house with a smell that pulled children straight out of bed. The grits simmered low on the stove, stirred patiently with butter until they became thick, creamy, and warm enough to hug the belly. When the plates came together, the crunch of the fish against the softness of the grits felt like magic, like two foods that were always meant to find each other. Kids begged for it all week long, knowing it was something that tasted better when the morning was slow and there was time to linger at the table. Fish and grits carried a rhythm, a memory, a connection to older generations who ate the same combination long before diners and frozen breakfasts took over. It tasted like home cooking, like care, like the kind of love that wakes up early. As families grew busier and mornings lost their unhurried pace, this breakfast faded into weekends, then holidays, then memories. But for anyone who grew up with it, one bite is enough to bring back the sound of grease popping, the soft bubbling of grits thickening on the stove, and the joy of a breakfast made with intention instead of convenience. Fish and grits was not just food, it was soul, comfort, and childhood all on one plate. Cream of wheat with butter and brown sugar was the smooth, warm breakfast that felt like a blanket you could eat, especially on cold mornings when the wind tapped against the windows and children had to be coaxed out of bed. Mothers stirred it constantly so it stayed silky, never lumpy, adding butter until it glistened and a spoonful of brown sugar that melted into swirls of caramel sweetness. It was gentler than grits, softer, the kind of food a child could eat half asleep. Before school, Cream of wheat sat steaming on the table beside toast or fruit, offering comfort that stuck with you all the way to the bus stop. It filled stomachs quickly and cheaply, which mattered in homes where every dollar had to stretch across a week. Kids sometimes sprinkled cinnamon, others added extra butter, turning the bowl into something they could claim as their own. The quiet joy of it lived in the routine, in the way the smell drifted through hallways before the sun even rose. But as instant packets and faster breakfasts took over, this slow-stirred version faded away. Still, for those who grew up in the 1960s, the memory remains bright. A warm bowl, a warm kitchen, and a mother standing at the stove making sure the morning started with something steady and good. Fried bologna sandwiches were the busy morning lifesaver Black mothers relied on when there was no time for fuss, but everyone still needed something filling before school. The bologna was sliced, sometimes cut with a little cross in the middle so it would fry flat in the skillet, sizzling until the edges curled and crisped, the bread toasted in butter or came straight from the bag, soft and warm from the heat of the fried meat pressed against it. A smear of mustard or a slice of cheese turned it into something glorious, far better than anyone expected from such simple ingredients. Kids loved the smokiness, the crunch, the way it felt like a treat even though it cost almost nothing and came together in minutes. Mothers loved that it kept everyone full until lunchtime. In the 1960s, fried bologna sandwiches were a working family staple, especially on mornings when chores were waiting, the clock was ticking, and no one could sit long at the table. Over time, breakfast sandwiches from drive-through windows replaced the homemade version, and children grew up without the sound of bologna popping against a hot skillet, but anyone who remembers it can still taste that first hot bite, can still remember standing in the kitchen holding a warm sandwich wrapped in a napkin, ready to run out the door. It was quick, comforting, and made with the kind of care only a busy mother can give. Country ham with red-eye gravy was the breakfast that tasted like luxury in the 1960s, even though it was born from thrift and necessity. When families could afford a slice of country ham, it felt like a celebration. The ham sizzled loudly in the pan, filling the kitchen with a rich, salty aroma that made children hover nearby with hungry eyes. After the ham was cooked, mothers poured hot coffee into the skillet to lift the browned bits from the bottom, creating a thin, savory gravy that looked simple but tasted unforgettable. That gravy soaked into biscuits or grits, turning every bite into something bold and comforting. Kids begged for it because it felt special, different, like something reserved for important mornings. But country ham was expensive even then, and most families saved it for weekends or holidays, which only made the memories stronger. Over time, as fresh ham became harder to find and diets shifted toward lighter breakfasts, this old Southern favorite drifted into memory. Yet for anyone raised on it, the flavor still sits deep in the heart. Salty, smoky, strong, softened by the warmth of gravy poured from a skillet that had cooked generations of meals. Buttermilk waffles from scratch were the weekend miracle that made children race to the table before the waffle iron even finished its first batch. Mothers mixed the batter by hand, whisking buttermilk, eggs, and flour until everything came together just right, thick enough to rise high but loose enough to pour smoothly. When the batter hit the hot iron, the kitchen filled with a warm, tangy smell that made everyone impatient. Kids waited with plates in hand, listening for the sizzle and the quiet click that meant the waffle was ready. These waffles were crisp on the outside and soft inside, with pockets perfect for butter and syrup. They tasted like a treat, something too time-consuming for weekdays but worth every minute on Saturday or Sunday mornings. Families sat together longer on waffle days, talking between bites, savoring the rare calm. As frozen waffles and pre-made mixes took over, the tradition faded, but the memory of real buttermilk waffles, golden, warm, and made with love, never disappeared. Leftover sweet potato biscuits reheated in butter were the second-day blessing children loved almost as much as the fresh ones. Mothers split the biscuits in half, placed them face down in a hot skillet with a little butter, and let them warm until the edges crisped and the centers softened again. The sweet potato inside gave them a gentle sweetness that deepened when they hit the heat, turning yesterday's biscuits into something new and irresistible. Kids stood at the stove waiting for their turn, knowing these biscuits were a rare treat that disappeared fast. They tasted like warmth, thrift, and tradition. Like a home where nothing good went to waste over time, fewer families made sweet potato biscuits from scratch, and even fewer reheated them this way. But people who grew up in the 1960s can still recall that first buttery bite and the joy of turning leftovers into something magical. Cornmeal mush, fried the next morning, was a Depression-era recipe that stayed beloved well into the 1960s because it made breakfast out of almost nothing. Mothers cooked cornmeal into a thick porridge the night before, poured it into a pan to cool, and sliced it into firm squares in the morning. Those squares hit the skillet with a soft hiss, browning until the outside turned crisp, while the inside stayed creamy. Kids ate it with syrup, butter, or sometimes a sprinkle of sugar, each version turning the simple dish into something comforting. It filled bellies cheaply and reliably, which mattered deeply in working families. As life grew easier and instant breakfasts appeared, fried cornmeal mush faded from everyday cooking. But for anyone who remembers it, the taste still carries the feeling of a home that made the most out of everything. Homemade cinnamon toast broiler style was the quick breakfast that tasted like dessert, made on mornings when mothers needed something fast but still warm and comforting. The bread was spread with butter, then sprinkled generously with sugar and cinnamon until it sparkled. Instead of using a toaster, mothers slid it under the broiler, watching carefully as the sugar melted and the edges browned. When it came out, the top crackled slightly like a thin caramel shell, and the smell filled the whole kitchen with sweetness. Kids loved how simple it was, how warm it felt, how it turned plain white bread into something that felt like a treat before school. Some children even sat on the counter just to watch it bubble, waiting for the moment it hit the plate still sizzling. But as boxed cereals took over and mornings sped up, this old-style cinnamon toast slipped quietly into the past, remembered fondly by anyone who once watched it bubble under the broiler. Rice and milk with sugar or butter was one of the simplest breakfasts of the 1960s, but one that carried a surprising amount of comfort. Mothers used leftover rice from dinner, warmed it with milk on the stove, and added either sugar or butter depending on what the child liked. It was creamy, warm, and soothing, the kind of food that filled you gently and kept you steady through the morning. Kids who grew up on it still talk about the way the bowl steamed on cold days, how it tasted plain but perfect, how it made mornings feel safe and unhurried. Some children stirred it slowly to cool it down, while others ate it fast, letting the sweetness carry them into the day. Over the years, this dish faded as families moved toward more processed breakfasts and quicker options. But for many, rice and milk will always taste like childhood. Cathead biscuits with honey or sorghum were named for their size, so big a child could barely hold one with both hands. Mothers mixed the dough quickly, without fuss, shaping biscuits that rose high and golden in the oven. When they came out, kids split them open to let honey or sorghum drip into every soft ridge. They were warm, filling, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that made you feel ready for the whole day. Some families saved them for weekends, while others relied on them whenever the house needed a little extra warmth in the morning. The smell of those biscuits drifting through the home could pull even the sleepiest child out of bed. Over time, homemade biscuits gave way to canned versions, but anyone who ever held a Cathead biscuit knows nothing else compares to its size, softness, or soul. Leftover chicken wings with biscuits were the kind of breakfast that made children jump out of bed even when the house was cold and the sun had barely risen. These were not plain wings, but the seasoned, crispy ones their mother cooked the night before, holding on to flavor that somehow tasted even better by morning. Reheating them in a cast-iron skillet brought back the crackle children knew by heart, and warm biscuits in the oven made the whole kitchen smell like comfort. Those biscuits soaked up every drop of seasoning, turning leftovers into something that felt like a gift. Mothers loved this meal because it was simple, filling, and never wasted a thing. Children loved it because it tasted like the night before had followed them into a new day. In the 1960s, Leftovers were not a shortcut but an extension of care. Today, they often feel like an afterthought, but anyone who grew up with wings and biscuits for breakfast still remembers the joy of starting the morning with yesterday's best food made warm again. Bacon ends and pieces with eggs were the breakfast that made children feel rich even when the family budget was tight. Ends were cheaper than full strips, but they carried more smoky flavor, crackling in a cast iron pan until the fat melted into a perfect base for scrambled eggs. Children begged for this breakfast because each bite tasted different, some salty, some crisp, some chewy, but all deeply satisfying. The eggs cooked in the drippings were soft, rich, and comforting in a way no quick breakfast could match. In the 1960s, families stretched every bit of food, and bacon ends proved you could make something memorable without buying the prettiest option at the store. As microwaved meals took over, fewer people kept this slow, flavorful breakfast alive, but those who remember can still hear the sizzle and see their mother's hands at the stove, turning scraps into something that felt like love on a plate. Stewed prunes or peaches over grits were the kind of breakfast that wrapped itself around children like warmth on a cold morning. The fruit simmered slowly until it softened into a syrupy topping that turned plain grits into something close to dessert. Whether their mother used prunes, peaches, or whatever fruit the pantry held, the result was always comforting. Children loved the creamy grits meeting the tender fruit, a sweet start that carried them through long school days. In the 1960s, this breakfast was common because it was cheap, filling, and relied on jars. Families had canned in the summer. The sweetness lingered as children gathered their books and coats over time. Quick cereals replaced slow-simmered fruit, but those who grew up with this dish still remember the smell of fruit bubbling on the stove before sunrise and the simple comfort of a warm bowl held between small hands. Homemade drop donuts were the kind of surprise that made school mornings feel like holidays. Mothers mixed a quick dough of flour, milk, sugar, and fat, dropping spoonfuls into hot oil until they puffed into golden, uneven little clouds. They were not fancy or decorated, just warm dough rolled in sugar while still steaming. Children hovered close to the counter, waiting for each new batch, the kitchen filled with sweetness that made everyone forget how early it was. These donuts were quick to make but tasted deeply homemade, the kind of treat families made when store-bought pastries were a luxury. As faster breakfast took over, drop donuts faded into memory. Still, anyone who ever bit into one straight from a cast-iron pot knows the feeling never fades. Soft, warm, and unforgettable. Cornbread and sweet milk was the breakfast that stretched across generations, simple enough for everyday mornings but comforting enough to feel special. Leftover cornbread was crumbled into a bowl and softened with warm whole milk until it turned into something between cereal and pudding. Children loved stirring it themselves, watching the bread swell as it soaked. The flavor was mild, sweet, and grounding, the kind of breakfast that steadied a child before a long school day. In the 1960s, this meal appeared often in homes where cornbread was baked daily and nothing went to waste. It kept families full without costing much or taking time. As boxed cereals replaced homemade breakfasts, this tradition slipped away. But anyone who ever stirred warm milk into crumbled cornbread at a kitchen table still remembers the comfort that rose from that simple bowl. Cheese toast was the crisp, melty breakfast children begged for before catching the school bus. A slice of bread topped with sharp cheddar melted under the broiler turned into something magical, equal parts simple and satisfying. The cheese bubbled and browned at the edges, creating a toasty, savory aroma that drifted through the whole kitchen. Children waited near the stove, eager for the moment their mother pulled the tray out. Cheese toast was quick, but felt special, especially on cold mornings when the heat of the broiler warmed the room. In the 1960s, families relied on meals like this because they were inexpensive yet filling, perfect for growing children who needed energy for the day ahead. The sharp cheddar gave the toast a richness that stayed with them until lunchtime. Over time, cheese toast drifted into the background as faster breakfasts took over. But the memory remains sharp and warm, like the flavor of that first bite. Pan-fried salt mackerel with grits was a breakfast children learned to love even before they understood why the house smelled like the ocean at sunrise. The fish was salty and strong, soaked overnight to soften its bite, then fried in a hot skillet until the edges crisped. Mothers served it alongside creamy grits that balanced the intensity of the fish children begged for it on weekends, especially in coastal towns where mackerel was common. The flavor was bold, unforgettable, and tied deeply to place and heritage. In the 1960s, this breakfast fed big families cheaply while offering a taste of tradition. Over the years, fewer families cooked salt mackerel as fresh options became more available. But for anyone who grew up with this meal, the memory clings like the smell of the skillet, strong, comforting, and impossible to forget. Banana and peanut butter toast was the quick, energy-packed breakfast mothers made when mornings were tight and children needed something hearty. Slices of banana pressed into peanut butter melted slightly on warm toast, creating a creamy, sweet, satisfying bite. Children loved it because it tasted indulgent even though it was simple. Mothers loved it because it was cheap, fast, and kept children full until lunch. In the 1960s, bananas were one of the most affordable fruits, and peanut butter was a pantry staple, making this breakfast accessible to families of all sizes. Over time, it faded behind packaged snacks and sugary cereals. Still, the memory of that sweet, sticky toast lingers for anyone who grew up eating it on the way out the door. Homemade sausage gravy over biscuits was the warm, stick-to-your-ribs breakfast that made winter mornings feel less harsh. Mothers cooked sausage in cast-iron skillets, breaking it into small pieces as it browned, then they stirred in flour and milk, turning the pan drippings into thick, savory gravy poured over fresh biscuits. Children begged for this breakfast because it felt rich and comforting, the kind of meal that wrapped the whole house in warmth. In the 1960s, families served it before long school days or church mornings. Over time, biscuit mixes and canned gravies replaced homemade versions, but nothing compares to the flavor of gravy made from scratch by someone who cared enough to stand at the stove and stir. Leftover pie for breakfast was the mischievous joy every child dreamed about the moment a holiday or big Sunday meal ended. The pie sat in the fridge overnight, the filling set perfectly, the crust softening in all the right ways. Children waited for the chance to grab a slice before anyone else woke up, sometimes whispering with siblings as they plotted who would sneak into the kitchen first. Mothers pretended to scold them, but almost always let it slide, knowing leftover pie made childhood a little sweeter. In the 1960s, this was not indulgence. It was simply what families did when dessert remained from the night before. Over time, the tradition faded behind busier mornings and stricter routines. But for anyone who ever ate pie in pajamas while the house was still quiet, the memory stays bright and irresistible. Fried salmon patties for breakfast might seem unusual today, but for many African American families in the 60s and 70s, canned salmon was a dependable pantry staple that worked for any meal of the day. Grandparents mixed the salmon with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasoning, shaping it into patties that sizzled in the skillet until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with something hearty and inviting, a bold start to the morning that made you feel ready for whatever the day demanded. Served with grits or biscuits, the patties tasted rich and satisfying, proof that canned ingredients could create meals full of flavor and comfort. Salmon was not expensive, but it felt special, which made breakfast feel special too. Children grew used to that savory taste long before they ever tried a restaurant version. Fried salmon patties were practical, filling, and unforgettable, a reminder of how creativity in the kitchen shaped so many childhood mornings. Sweet potato pancakes brought earthy sweetness and warm spice to kitchen tables, blending mashed sweet potatoes with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a splash of milk. The batter sizzled as it hit the griddle, releasing a fragrance that filled the room with comfort. Each cake browned to a gentle crisp outside while remaining moist and tender within, offering natural sweetness without the need for heavy syrup. Many families grew their own sweet potatoes, making these pancakes a natural way to use the harvest through cooler months. Some cooks stirred in chopped pecans for a nutty crunch, while others added a hint of ginger for extra warmth. Served with a dollop of butter or a drizzle of cane syrup, sweet potato pancakes became a Saturday morning favorite, reminding everyone of autumn fields and family traditions. This dish honored the African-American love for root vegetables and the creativity of home cooks who turned humble ingredients into breakfast plates bursting with flavor and cultural memory. Fried bologna on white bread was one of the most common breakfasts for working families during the Civil Rights era. Bologna was affordable, and frying it in a skillet brought out flavor and made it feel more substantial. Layered on soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, it became a sandwich that was cheap, quick, and filling. For children, it was often packed as lunch, but for adults, it was breakfast before long shifts in fields, factories, or offices. The salty, savory taste was familiar and comforting, even if it came from one of the cheapest meats available. Fried bologna sandwiches symbolized both thrift and practicality, reflecting the reality of what many households relied on to get by. They were humble, but they carried enough strength to power people through demanding days. This dish became part of the memory of struggle and perseverance, a reminder that even inexpensive food could play a role in fueling determination and resilience. Pine bark bread was a dish of desperation, made when even flour was beyond reach. Families ground the inner bark of pine trees into meal, mixing it with what little grain they could scrape together. The result was a coarse, dense bread that carried the taste of the woods themselves. It was not made out of preference, but out of survival when fields failed and store shelves were empty. Children ate it because there was nothing else, learning early that hunger left no room for choice. The bread filled stomachs, even if its flavor was harsh, and it kept families going through days when dignity was tested. Housewives baked it with determination, knowing their skill in stretching scraps could mean the difference between going hungry or surviving. Pine bark bread has disappeared from memory, but it once represented the hardest truth of living under Jim Crow poverty, that people endured by any means necessary, turning even trees into food when everything else was taken. Fried fatback with biscuits was the kind of breakfast that came from deep tradition, from years when every part of the animal was used and nothing was taken for granted. Before bacon became the breakfast standard, fatback was the salty, sizzling star of the morning. Grandparents sliced it thick and fried it until the edges crisped and curled, releasing a savory aroma that filled the whole house. The drippings soaked into fresh biscuits, turning them into something rich and flavorful without needing butter or gravy. The combination was simple but powerful. A pairing that carried families through long days of labor, and school fatback was inexpensive, accessible, and packed with flavor, which made it a natural choice for rural homes and city kitchens alike. Children grew up associating that salty crunch with mornings spent around crowded tables, hands reaching for biscuits still warm from the oven. Even though fatback is rarely seen in modern breakfast routines, the memory of it remains strong for those who grew up with its bold taste. It represents a time when meals came from resourcefulness, from tradition, and from knowing how to make the most of what you had. Country sausage and red pepper gravy turned ordinary biscuits into a feast, combining smoky pork with the sweetness of peppers and onions. Sausage browned slowly in a heavy skillet, releasing drippings that formed the base of a creamy gravy thickened with flour and milk. Strips of red bell pepper and chopped onions simmered in the mixture, lending a vibrant color and a subtle sweetness that balanced the savory richness. Poured over split biscuits or spooned onto grits, the gravy soaked into every layer, ensuring each bite was flavorful and filling. In African American kitchens of the 1970s, this dish represented comfort and abundance, a way to stretch a small amount of meat into a meal for the entire family. Some cooks added a touch of crushed red pepper for gentle heat, while others served sliced tomatoes alongside for freshness. Country sausage and red pepper gravy brought together bold taste and home-style satisfaction, making mornings feel special even on the busiest days. Cornmeal donuts were one of the rare indulgences families created when they wanted sweetness but had little to spend. Made from cornmeal mixed with flour, eggs if available, and sweetened with a touch of sugar or molasses, The dough was shaped into rounds and fried in lard until golden. Dusted with sugar, they became a treat that brought children running to the table. Unlike bakery donuts, these were dense, filling, and rustic, but they carried a charm that came from being homemade. Families turned to them especially on weekends or special mornings when a little extra joy was needed to break the monotony of hardship. Cornmeal donuts were proof that celebration could exist even in times of scarcity, transforming everyday ingredients into something special. They were portable too, often tucked into lunch pails for later in the day. Cornmeal donuts may not have been fancy, but they were treasured, carrying both sweetness and comfort into mornings that demanded resilience. Wild blackberry cobbler was one of the simplest desserts, but also one of the most joyful, pulled straight from the land itself. Families and children foraged blackberries along fences, ditches, and backfields, filling tin pails with whatever they could gather. The berries were tart and often scratched from brambles, but once baked into a cobbler with biscuit dough or cornmeal crust, they became a dish of celebration. Sugar was scarce, but even a little was enough to transform the berries into something special. Cobbler was not just food, it was an event, often marking the height of summer when blackberries ripened. Children loved the sweetness, licking their fingers after every bite, while adults cherished the memory of turning foraged fruit into dessert. In a time of scarcity, wild blackberry cobbler proved that joy could still be found in simple things. It was survival with sweetness, a reminder that nature still offered gifts even under the weight of Jim Crow oppression. Fried apples and biscuits turned simple fruit into a morning celebration. Apples were sliced thin, tossed into a skillet of melted butter and dusted with sugar until they softened and gleamed like caramel. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone to the table. Served warm beside soft biscuits, the apples made their own syrup, sticky and golden, perfect for spooning or dipping. It was the sort of breakfast that reminded families that sweetness did not have to come from fancy ingredients. It could come from what grew in their own backyard. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg found its way into the pan, giving each bite a touch of warmth that lingered. Fried apples and biscuits were especially loved in fall when orchards overflowed and waste was never an option. Grandparents knew how to stretch everything: a few apples, a bit of butter, and the will to make something memorable. This dish was their way of turning simplicity into comfort, of teaching that care was the secret ingredient in any meal. It was nostalgia on a plate, sweet, soft, and glowing, like a memory you could taste. Rice and raisins with butter was the kind of breakfast that felt like a treat, even though it came from the most basic pantry ingredients a household always had on hand. Long before sugary cereal brands took over the shelves, many families started their day with a warm bowl of rice simmered until soft and mixed with sweet raisins that plumped in the heat. A pat of butter melted over the top, coating each grain and adding richness that made the dish feel far more indulgent than its low cost suggested. It was warm, steady, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that felt like a hug before school or chores. Grandparents made it because rice was cheap, raisins lasted forever in a jar, and butter brought everything together in a way that tasted wholesome and familiar. Some added a sprinkle of sugar, others a dash of cinnamon, but most kept it simple, letting the steam rise like a quiet morning ritual. The flavor was gentle, the sweetness mild, and the bowl always seemed to disappear faster than expected. For many families, this dish was tied to winter mornings, cold floors, and the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Even today, people who grew up with rice and raisins remember the way it filled the house with warmth and made them feel ready for anything. Poached eggs on toast were breakfast elegance in a world that rarely had time for it. Water simmered just below boiling, and eggs were lowered gently, their whites curling around the yolks like soft silk. When lifted out and set on buttered toast, they gleamed, tender, trembling, and perfect. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed. It was a dish that made even a modest kitchen feel refined. The first cut of the knife released a golden stream that soaked into the bread, rich and warm. This breakfast carried a sense of calm. the quiet kind that came before a day's labor. Grandparents who made poached eggs treated it like a ritual, never rushed, always patient. It was proof that even in lean times, beauty could live on the breakfast plate. Poached eggs on toast weren't about luxury. They were about intention, about giving the morning the dignity it deserved. If one of these breakfasts stirred an old memory or made you crave a taste of home, tell me your favorite in the comments and tap like and subscribe so we can keep bringing these stories back to the table.